The Nintendo 64 often gets criticism and sometimes is even considered a commercial failure. It's also commonly compared to the PlayStation. Was the N64 really a failure, and why didn't it perform as well as the PlayStation? Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Podrez coming at you with another video. A little fun fact, this is the first console I ever bought with my own money, or rather my brother and I saved up for it. Alright, so if you've seen a couple of my videos and you like what I do, hit that subscribe button down there. And check out our Discord server, discord.podrez.net. Anyway, let's talk about the Nintendo 64. Nintendo had a very comfortable lead in the home console market with the NES. Even when their competitor Sega came out with a console with better hardware, it still couldn't beat Nintendo's superior third-party support and lineup of games. It seemed like there was no one in sight that could match Nintendo's success. The Super Nintendo was also a very successful console, but Nintendo's lead wasn't as comfortable as before. The Genesis, while struggling to compete against Nintendo initially, was starting to have great success after a price drop and the introduction of Sonic. The Genesis and Super Nintendo were more neck and neck, when before it was a landslide. The Super Nintendo also didn't sell as much as its predecessor, 49 million units instead of 61 million. The competition would become more fierce when the Sega Saturn was announced. With their declining lead in the home console market, Nintendo realized they need to consider new hardware. Initially, Nintendo worked with Philippe and Sony to make a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo, but neither agreement worked out and each of those two companies would make their own game consoles. I'm sure Nintendo probably regretted giving themselves two more competitors. During the development of the Sega Saturn, Tom Kalinske, who was the CEO of Sega, tried to negotiate a deal with the company Silicon Graphics to make a graphics chip for their upcoming console. Silicon Graphics was interested in adapting their technology into the home console market. They initially were going to work with Sega first and then Nintendo if an agreement could not be reached. Fortunately for Nintendo, Silicon Graphics would end up working with them. Development for this new console would begin under the codename Project Reality. The hardware was expected to be released in arcades and then as a home console shortly after. Silicon Graphics would manufacture the Onyx computer, which was meant for programming games for Project Reality. Because the technology was new, this was 1993 after all, the computer was expensive, over $100,000. This is obviously a very high price, but the company was expecting the final product, the console itself, to be less than $250. A prototype controller was also built that resembles the Super Nintendo one, but it had an analog joystick and a Z-trigger. In 1994, Nintendo would give an official name for the console. In Japan, it would be called the Ultra Famicom, and in the US it would be called the Ultra 64. But Nintendo wanted to keep the name consistent for all regions, so they went with the name Nintendo 64. This would be one of the first times Nintendo ever did that because the NES and Super Nintendo had different names in Japan. The initial release of the N64 was going to be November of 1995, but it was delayed until April of 1996. Nintendo claimed that it was so that third-party companies could develop more games, but a Silicon's graphics engineer claimed it was due to hardware issues. It would be delayed again, this time until June of 1996, because Nintendo was afraid they didn't have enough units to meet the demand of consumers. While it's unfortunate, I do think Nintendo made the right move by making sure the console was ready to go before releasing it. You don't want to rush things, you know? There would be a lot of hype before release, even some preferring it over the competitors despite it not being released yet. The Nintendo 64 would finally be released in June of 1996 in Japan and September of 1996 in the US. The launch went very well in the US. Nintendo sold out of their initial shipment of 300,000 units on the first day. This was even better than the Saturn and PlayStation's launch. The price was originally going to be $250, but to be more competitive, it was dropped to just $200. Nintendo made some bold decisions with the hardware. It's one of the first consoles to have 4 controller ports. The PlayStation and Saturn only had 2. The controllers supported analog right off the bat, unlike the competition. Most people don't like this controller for understandable reasons. The 3 handles are strange and the analog stick is known for wearing out over time. But it's a great starting point and future controllers would improve upon this concept. One of the biggest surprises is the fact that the N64 takes cartridges when the Saturn and PlayStation moved over to CDs. CDs carry way more space, but cartridges improve the loading time of games. We're going to talk more about this later and how cartridges ended up hurting the console overall. The Nintendo 64 was region-locked. It's standard for console manufacturers to region-lock their hardware, meaning that Japanese exclusive games cannot be played on an American console. Thankfully, you don't have to be region-locked ever again thanks to our video sponsor, Private Internet Access VPN. For those who don't know, a VPN connects your computer or phone to a remote server, which lets you change your IP and location as well as encrypt your data. The Office is one of my favorite TV shows, but Netflix doesn't let US subscribers watch it. With Private Internet Access VPN, I can easily change my location and get around the region lock. It's compatible with all the major streaming services: Netflix, Hulu, Disney+, HBO Go, and more. It's also available on all platforms like Windows, Mac, Linux, Android, and iPhone. Nintendo might have been able to limit us in the 90s, but thanks to Private Internet Access VPN, that's no longer possible today. VPNs also hide your usage from your internet service provider and phone carrier. Your ISP knows exactly what you're doing on the internet. Private Internet Access VPN not only keeps your ISP from seeing your data, but they also never store or record your data themselves thanks to their no logs policy. It's also useful for phones. Many wireless plans only let you stream up to 480p video quality when you're not on Wi-Fi, but with Private Internet Access VPN, I can easily bypass this restriction and stream in 4K quality. If you're interested in keeping your data secure, using streaming services region-free, or bypassing video throttles, go to piavpn.com/poger and get an 83% discount. That's only $2.03 a month, and you get 4 months free. You have nothing to lose, as there is a 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you, Private Internet Access VPN, for sponsoring this video. With all this talk about cartridges and games, let's take a look at a few. I have to talk about Super Mario 64. You control Mario in a 3D environment, and you must collect 70 stars in each world to defeat Bowser. Unlike previous Mario games, you can't turn big or small except in one stage, and there's no Fire Flower. You can actually punch in this game, and it's one of the first times we get to hear Mario's voice. The game is revolutionary. There weren't that many 3D games yet, and a lot of the ones that did exist suffered from bad camera controls. In 2D games, you didn't have to worry about the camera too much, but for 3D games, most developers didn't have a good solution yet. In Super Mario 64, you have full control of the camera and you're able to zoom in and out. Unlike older Mario games, you're constantly re-entering levels so you can collect more stars. You don't just complete the stage and then move on. This gives the game more replayability and gives you more incentive to play through the levels. It might seem rehashy, but you don't have to collect every star in the game. This title really shows what the N64 is capable of, and it would set the standard for future 3D platformers. Here's Beetle Adventure Racing. It's a racing game where you have to get a certain placement to advance to the next course. You only get one chance, but if you collect enough of the numbered boxes throughout the stage, you can earn a continue. These are definitely worth collecting, as the game does get much harder later on. The game has a lot of shortcuts, but some of them are not actually shorter. As you make it further in the game, you can unlock new stages and vehicles. There's 6 stages in the game total, which is short, but you do get a lot of content in each of them. There's many alternate paths you can take, and the graphics contain so much detail. To me, it doesn't feel like a small game at all. There's also a battle mode where you can play up to 4 players. While this is a great game, it is janky. The hit detection is weird to the point where you can clip through certain boundaries. It's fun to do this, but obviously the developers didn't intend on this. The frame rate is also not the best, which will be a common trend on the N64. Still though, this is one of the better titles. Let's try F-Zero X. The Super Nintendo game was a good way to show off the console's capabilities. The N64 game does the same thing. It's a racing game where you have to get the highest placement possible. There's 3 cups to choose from, each of which have 6 tracks. There's also a 4th cup that I don't have unlocked. Your vehicle has a life bar that depletes every time you hit a wall or another racer. You can replenish your health with the pink ooze. After the first lap, you can speed boost at the cost of some of your health. The game is way more strict than other racing titles. If you fall off the stage, you lose a life, when in most games you just lose time. And you also can't crash too many times or else you run out of health. This is one of the few games to run at a perfect 60 frames a second. This is impressive considering you're racing against 30 opponents. It's also a large game with more than 20 stages to race through. Some of the levels have creative concepts like racing inside of a cylinder and racing outside of one. Unlike the Super Nintendo game where it's a completely flat surface, here you're going all around, even upside down. I like the original F-Zero, but I think this one is way better. The console had a few 2D platformers that are worth talking about. In Kirby 64, you can combine two abilities into one. This unlocks a huge number of new abilities. Despite Kirby being restricted to a 2D environment, we do get some nice 3D graphics with lots of detail. I remember seeing the commercial for this game when I was a kid and being terrified. Overall though, this is a fantastic game. In Yoshi's story, you must collect a certain number of fruits to beat the stage. While it is 2D, the game uses a lot of rotation and scaling to remind you that this is an N64 game. It's an okay title, but a bit of a departure from Yoshi's Island. The stages are way too short, and the graphics for N64 standards do not impress. The N64 has a lot of excellent multiplayer games. In Mario Party, you're competing in mini-games against 3 other opponents. The first game was a great start, but rough around the edges. Some of the mini-games are stupid, and there weren't a lot of features yet. Mario Party 2 added features like items, and the mini-games were much improved. GoldenEye is a first-person shooter that really proved that this genre was possible on home consoles. Smash Bros. Is a platform fighting game with Nintendo characters. I still remember that classic commercial on TV with the costumes beating each other up. I remember getting this game for Christmas and being so excited. This was a very fun game to play against friends. Honestly, this is a phenomenal game and one of the first of its kind. So as a whole, the N64 had something that most other consoles didn't, the ability to play 4-player games. The fact that you could have 4 people sitting on the couch and playing the same game was so much fun. Unfortunately, there were some major flaws that held the console back. The hardware was very complex and therefore very difficult to program for. Many games ran at a poor frame rate with only a small handful of titles running at 60 frames a second. If you play any N64 game for a couple minutes and then switch over to F-Zero X, you'll know what I'm talking about. Let's talk about the cartridge again, because this ended up being a big mistake. Nintendo preferred them for faster loading time, but many game developers hated them. Games could hold up to 64 kilobytes of ROM space compared to the PlayStation CD-ROM, which could hold up to 650 megabytes. With only 64 megabytes to work with, some developers had to come up with tricks to stay within the limit. With the PlayStation though, there was a lot more wiggle room. Cartridges were also more expensive to produce than CDs, meaning the publishers had to spend more money on making games for the N64 than the PlayStation. Imagine spending more money to produce your games and then it doesn't sell well. That's a huge risk if you choose Team Nintendo. On the other hand, producing PlayStation games wasn't as expensive and there was less risk involved. In the past, Nintendo would beat their competition with their excellent third-party support, but they would lose a lot of third-party support on the N64 because it made more sense to join Team Sony. When you think of some of the best N64 games, a majority of them are first or second third-party titles. Can you think of a single third-party one? The Nintendo 64 sold 33 million units worldwide, which is far less than their previous 2 consoles. In Japan, it was a commercial failure, only selling 6 million. It performed worse than the PS1 and Saturn in that region. It's believed that the reason the console failed in Japan was because of the lack of RPGs, because a lot of the companies that were making them moved over to the PlayStation. In the US though, the console was way more successful, selling 20 million out of the 33 million units. Unlike in Japan, the N64 actually did outsell the Saturn, but the PlayStation was able to make it on top, selling 40 million units in the US. Nintendo was not able to retain their lead in the home console market. But is the N64 a commercial failure? In Japan, it definitely was, but in the US, it depends on how you look at it. The console undersold, Nintendo lost a lot of third-party support, and the PlayStation outsold it. But the N64 did have a strong launch, it does have a great lineup of games, and it did sell a respectable 20 million units. It was also a great console that had some cool innovations that had never been done before. In my opinion, I don't think the console exceeded Nintendo's expectations, but I also don't think it was a commercial failure. Let me know in the comments what you think. Is the N64 a good console, and would you consider it a success or a failure? Thanks for watching. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.